Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be making these Indigo bookmarks. I recently finished my sketchbook, so I made a new one and I had a lot of scrap paper, and making bookmarks is just a good way of using up those smaller pieces. For these bookmarks, I decided to keep it simple and only use one color because this way I can play a little bit more with the layering and play of value. I decided to use indigo, but you can also choose other colors as well. For accents, I decided to use the champagne color from my Finetec Gold palette. You can also use other shimmery colors or just use bleed-proof white to add some accents if you would like to. Since the scrap paper that I had was quite small, I decided to cut them up straight away into bookmark sizes. This is 5 centimeters by 13 centimeters. The paper is Canson XL 300 GSM because I find that using 300 GSM paper, it makes them much more sturdy. If you have a larger piece of scrap paper, you don't have to cut them up first. This way it's much easier to tape and mask the sides. As for me, I'm just going to eyeball more or less the distance between the paper and use washi tape to create a frame. As you can see though, I didn't do such a good job with the distancing, so I ended up cutting the washi tape in half in order to get more or less the same width for the rest of the frames. But saying all this, you can also make these bookmarks without a frame and paint right to the edge. I just find that the frame will bring the whole leaf doodles together, and this way I also don't have to deal much with the paper warping. Now let's get right into it. I want to create a wet on wet background, so I'm just going to evenly distribute the water across all of my bookmarks. I just want it to be lightly dampened, but not puddling wet. After dampening the surface, I need a bit more water on my brush, so I just took a little bit to dampen my brush again, and I took around a medium consistency of indigo to spread it across the paper randomly. As you can see, parts of the paper is drying faster than other areas, but this is completely fine because this will just give a little bit more dynamic to the whole composition as the watercolor bloom up differently. You can also play around with the consistency. You can try a lighter consistency and a thicker consistency for a darker or a lighter value. At this point, because the surface is still really damp, it's okay to use a darker consistency because the paint will bloom out and lighten naturally anyway. On the right hand side, since I felt it was a bit too dry, I added a bit more water, and I'm going to apply the paint in the same way as before. As I mentioned earlier, because of the wet surface, the paint will spread and lighten. So for some parts which are a little bit too light, I like to dot in a slightly thicker consistency or just create additional circles. And I'm doing this on a slightly damp surface, so the edges will soften and the value won't be too dark. On the last bookmark on the top right corner, I felt like the paint was just piling on top of each other a bit too much, and since the surface is still wet, I just use a clean dry brush to pick up the excess paint, and I'm just going to use a hair dryer to dry off the background completely. Now here comes the fun part. I'm going to start by using a thick consistency of the indigo, and I also switched to my size 0 brush. Here I'm going to create two slightly curved lines from the top and also the bottom of this first bookmark for the stems of the leaves. As for the leaves here, I've switched to a Filbert brush. This is so I can easily create rounded tips for the leaves, but you can also use a round brush depending on the leaf shape that you're going for. I just find that the application is so much easier for this type of leaf with a Filbert brush. I've actually bought this brush a while back, but this is the first time using it. I'm planning on including this brush in my paintings in the future to just see if it's worthwhile to include as one of my go-to brush tips, and maybe once I get a better feeling, I might make a specific video regarding the brush tip if you guys are interested. So far, after using this brush for this specific painting or DIY, I'm actually enjoying it because it can get a little bit tricky to paint soft corners sometimes with my usual round brush because it has such a sharp tip. With this said though, if you only have a round brush available, if you do want to paint these rounded leaves, I would suggest for you to paint an outline for each leaf while using the tip before filling in the rest of the leaves. After I finished painting on the leaves on the main stems, I decided to add some more in a slightly thinner consistency to give more depth for this doodle, but I'm also going to stick to just one leaf shape per bookmark so it can be a set, and I'm just going to continue on until I feel like I have a good distribution of these leaves. For some tighter spaces, it's also okay to overlap some of the previous leaves. Just make sure that the previous leaves are completely dry before you decide to overlap them so the paint doesn't bleed out. By the way, if you're finding it a bit difficult to paint a specific angle, you can always twist or rotate the paper around to make it much easier on your wrist. For me, I'm not rotating much because I don't want the painting to be off the frame, so I can show you guys a little bit more clearly. I'm going to move on to the second one while I wait for the first bookmark to dry, starting with the stems again using my size 0 brush, and this time I created a very long S shape on both sides from the top and the bottom. This time I also switched to my round brush to make a pointier type of leaf, so it's different from the first bookmark. Just like the first bookmark, however, I'm just going to paint it on either side of the stem as well as the top, but this time I'm going to alternate one after the other. As I get closer to the bottom, I'm going to start painting the leaves on either side, and I also want to enlarge the size of each leaf while maintaining the amount of space in between so I have enough space for all of the leaves. If you've also noticed, this time I'm using a thicker consistency, so the blue or the indigo is much more prominent, and this I find just gives a bit more contrast to the really light background. As an extra tip for the placement of these leaves, I've left out a bit of space in between the leaves and the main stem so I can connect each leaf to a shorter stem, and this extra space in between will give more of an airiness to the painting, which in turn will help make the leaves look a bit more delicate. And that's basically it for the second one. I'm going to finish off the rest of the leaves here. As for the last bookmark, I'm going to create ferns, and just like before, I'm starting with my size 0 brush to paint the main stem, but this time I'm going to paint smaller stems branching out on either side. For the smaller stems, I also curved the line slightly to give it a bit more movement so it doesn't look so stiff. And just like the previous bookmarks, I'm going to paint another one from the top. After this, I'm going to switch to my Filbert brush again, and I'm going to paint very tiny leaves on either side of those small branches. Because the shape of the Filbert brush is already rounded, it only takes one stroke to create each of those leaves, so I'm putting more pressure when I'm painting the tip. Then as I get closer to the ends or where it's touching the stems, I take off more pressure so the lines are a little bit thinner. If you are using a round brush though, I would suggest for you to do it the same way as how you painted the first bookmark, which is to draw the outline first with the tip of the round brush, then fill in the rest of the space. And just like the previous leaves, please feel free to rotate the paper around in order for your wrist to paint in a comfortable position. This part is very repetitive, so I'm just going to continue until I fill in all of these small branches with the tiny leaves. Meanwhile, I hope you enjoy painting along or watching the process while listening to this soft, relaxing music. Just like any other doodle, it's up to you how far you want to take this. Technically, you can call this finished already, but I want to add a bit more texture. So after I'm done with the final leaves here, I'm going to switch to my Chinese calligraphy brush. And here I'm using a dry brush load, so the tip of my brush kind of separates and I get to create several lines. And with this, I'm just going to add some swizzles and curved lines for added texture. You can also try to use a frayed brush to get a similar effect. I feel like some of the values are a little bit too light, so I'm going back in with a medium consistency of this indigo, and I'm just going to paint on some additional circles and dots in the empty areas. And after that, I'm just going to dry everything off with a hairdryer. Lastly, I'm going to add some shimmery accents, and this is the lightest color in my Finetec Gold palette. With this color, I just wanted to try to go over the lightest fern or leaf in the first bookmark, and I found that the color was a little bit too light since there was a bit too much water, so I ended up going over it with a slightly thicker consistency. Since the shimmery color is quite light and almost opaque, it's actually very nice to be painted on the darker areas, so I'm going to be placing most of the accents on top of the circles that I previously painted. For these extra accents, I mostly just paint on dots on top of parts of the darker circles, and even on the wider areas if there's a bit of space, I just change up the shape of the dots. Some of them are a bit more rounded while the ones here are a bit more oval and vertical. You can customize this and add any other shapes or markings you would like to. I personally don't want to add too much though, because I don't want the gold shimmers to take away from the main focal point, which are the leaves. Since I really like how this shimmery color look on top of the dark circles, I ended up painting on the midrib very thinly on top of these leaves since they're fairly dark in value. Since I've only painted 2 ferns, I felt like it would be nice to have some shimmery ferns for this one as well, so I ended up using a thick consistency to paint more smaller versions of the fern on top of the darker circles. After painting a few of them, however, I felt like this one was inconsistent with the rest of the bookmarks because of the missing dots. So I ended up adding really small dots to this one because I really don't want these dots to take away from the fern. Lastly, I'm going to go back to the first bookmark because I felt like there's less shimmers in this one. So just like the second one, I ended up adding the midribs to the leaves. After that, we're basically done with all of the elements, but it's always good to look over the whole set again to make sure everything's consistent with each other. I ended up adjusting and adding more dots to the first bookmark to make sure that the composition is nice and balanced. Once I'm happy with everything, I'm going to unmask the sides to reveal these bookmarks. And here are the completed bookmarks. I'm actually really happy with the combination of indigo and the light shimmers. But just like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, you can also use any other colors you would like. It will just have a different feel to the doodles, but most colors would generally go well with added silver or gold shimmers. And that is it for the tutorial. If you guys enjoyed this type of content and would like to see more, don't forget to subscribe and click on the bell icon to get notified of new videos that I post every Friday. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!